Okay, let's get going. Thank you so much for joining this SDEC session on Adobe Analytics and Saint classifications. My name is Adam Greco, and I'm part of Search Discovery. I've been working with Adobe Analytics for about 20 years now, been part of lots of implementations. I've consulted on the product, and I've also been client side. Also wrote the book for Adobe on Adobe Analytics, and excited to share some more Adobe information with everyone. So for those of you who are new to the SDEC, this is a free community that Search Discovery has started to cover 12 topic areas related to digital analytics. If you are new to the SDEC, or maybe someone forwarded this to you, if you would like to join the SDEC, you can either sign up on our website or you can email me at sdec@searchdiscovery.com and I'll get you into the group. Once you're a member of the SDEC, you can see all past webinars in our Slack group, all for free. During the webinar today, if you have questions, please put them in the Zoom Q&A area. That's where I'm going to go to look for questions after I'm done presenting. And even if I don't get to your question, I'll try to follow up afterwards in written format in the Slack group if I don't get to it. If you have any other questions you want to mention privately or you don't want to share publicly, you could always email at sdec@searchdiscovery.com. And this webinar will be recorded and posted in the Adobe Analytics channel in the Slack group. So let's jump in and talk about Saint classifications. So before we actually get into the content, just for fun, I would like to see if anyone out there thinks they know what the acronym SAINT stands for. So you can use the chat bot, use the chat area of Zoom and either just send it to panelists, or you could, if everyone closes their eyes, put in the chat area what you think SAINT means when it was first originated. Don't cheat and look at other people's answers. Just keep typing down. Okay, so I'm starting to see a bunch of people put in the right answer. So very good. We've got some Omniture/Adobe historians out there. So for those of you who weren't sure what it meant, this is what SAINT actually stands for. It is the Site Catalyst Attribute Import Naming Tool with the acronym of SAINT. So just a little fun history there. Okay, so let's talk about Adobe Analytics and Saint classifications. So what are Saint classifications? Saint classifications is a feature of Adobe Analytics that allows you to add metadata to Adobe Analytics dimensions. And those dimensions obviously are EVARs and SPROPs. Saint classifications really have no bearing on success events in Adobe Analytics. These are typically used to add metadata to things that you're already capturing in JavaScript in a variable, such as maybe external campaigns. You want to add a bunch more attributes to external campaigns, or products, or maybe even a user ID, or content. It really can be used with any EVAR or SPROP. Now, the power of Saint classifications is that they allow you to augment data that you collect with after the fact data. And the cool part about Saint classifications is that this metadata that you're adding via Saint is retroactive, which means that it will apply as soon as you upload it or add it to Adobe Analytics. It will work in the past and the future. And that can confuse some people who are new to Adobe Analytics. So just to give you an example, let's say that you're doing a marketing campaign and you have a bunch of campaign codes that are associated when people come to your website. You're capturing those in JavaScript. But at the time that you're launching the campaign, maybe all the details of the campaign aren't known. So you don't have the official name of the campaign, or you're not sure which type you're going to fall that it's going to fall under, or even who the owner of each code is going to ultimately be. Well, these can be added via Saint as attributes after the campaign is launched. So even though you're collecting data in the campaign codes, in the s.campaigns variable, all that's being captured in JavaScript. You can capture that today and then later upload the metadata. And that metadata that you upload will work in the past and going forward. So even though you've captured campaign codes last month, even if you wait a full 30 days before you upload the metadata around that campaign, when you look back 30 days, you will still be able to see all of those attributes with the data that was associated with the code that they are associated with. So saint classifications allow you to also group data into more meaningful buckets. So for example, if you have a bunch of campaign codes and all of those are part of one marketing channel, then you can upload the same marketing channel for thousands of different individual codes. And then when you look at the marketing channel metadata attribute in Adobe Analytics, it will group all of the success events and data for all of those thousands of codes into one line item for that marketing channel. You can also group products into product categories, as I'm showing on the right here. You might have thousands of products and you want to group them into categories. Or you might have a bunch of blog posts or pieces of content that you want to group into different content areas. Whatever you want to group together, you can use saint classifications to do it. And in that respect, when people get confused about saint classifications, I kind of remind people that these are really like Adobe Analytics version of pivot tables in a way that you can kind of group data into buckets. Now, saint classification metadata reports are treated just like any other dimension in Adobe Analytics. So if you see here, I have the tracking code report in Adobe Analytics, but I've added a bunch of saint classifications for vendor, category, placement, item, channel. Well, all of those are treated as separate reports in Adobe Analytics. And here on the left, I'm showing the old interface, and on the right, I'm showing it in Analysis Workspace. In Analysis Workspace, you'll notice at the far right, there's a little indicator that tells you what the actual root variable is, that those are all metadata attributes of tracking code. So your users really won't know when they're looking at a report, whether it's an actual data point that was collected in JavaScript, or if it's a metadata report that is a saint classification. So you got to keep that in mind, because while you may know it, they may not understand that. Now, saint classifications are treated like all other dimensions in Adobe Analytics in pretty much every way. So for example, if you want to build a segment, you could use a saint classification in a segment. So if you want to build a segment that says, I want to look at all visitors or visits where the channel that they came from was email, it would be kind of annoying if you had to build a segment in which you had to list out all the 500 or 1,000 different campaign codes that all were associated with email. Instead, you can group them or classify them into the channel of email and then build a segment just on the channel equaling email. That will save you an enormous amount of time and work. So you can use any saint classification when building a segment. And since virtual report suites are built upon segments, that means that you could use a saint classification to build or partially build a virtual report suite. So here you'll see that I have a virtual report suite of looking for competitors who are reading my blog posts, which is something I used to do in my old consulting days. So what I would do is I would use a company like Demandbase to track the company that was on my blog, and then I would manually set a saint classification with companies that I deemed as consulting competitors. And then I would be able to kind of monitor how much of my blog was being viewed by competitors and which blog posts they found interesting. So again, segments can be used, segmentation can be used both in regular reports or for virtual report suites. Now, you also can use segments when creating calculated metrics. So when you add a segment to a calculated metric, that's affectionately known as creating a derived metric. So in this case, if I want to look at a new metric that I want to add to my implementation called email visits, what I can do is take visits, apply the segment of channel equals email, and then save it. And now I have a brand new derived metric that is showing me a trend of email visits. And then same classifications can also be used in the alert area. So alerts allow you to kind of be notified if there's certain thresholds that are met, if you've got certain anomalies. Well, these can be defined and customized with same classifications as well. So how do you create Saint classifications? So this is done in the administration console of Adobe Analytics. And as I mentioned, any EVAR or SPROP can have classifications added, and classifications can even have sub-classifications, which I'm showing here with a vendor and then a sub-classification of channel. Now, personally, I don't recommend using sub-classifications. I find them to be really complicated, and a lot of people mess up the metadata associated with them. And there's really not a huge benefit of using a sub-classification. I would rather just use better naming conventions, just have them all kind of on a flat hierarchy, but totally up to you. But when you're in the admin console, in this case, when we're looking at campaign, if you hover over the green chevron or triangle and basically click to add a classification, then that will add another branch off. And you have to set up the classifications first before you can start sending any metadata in. So if you don't have admin rights to your implementation, then you'll have to work with one of your administrators to make sure that they add any sync classifications that you want. But again, can be added to any EVAR or SPROP. Now, after you've created the sync classifications, if you have multiple report suites, this is just kind of a lesson that I've learned, like a war story, is that I highly recommend that if you have multiple report suites, that you keep your Saint classifications consistent across all of them. And the way you would do that is you would select multiple report suites at one time, and then set up your classifications with all of the report suites selected. Adobe will then make the same classifications apply to all report suites. Not only does it save you time, but if you decide that you have the same classifications across multiple report suites, you can use the FTP feature of same classifications to actually upload metadata to multiple report suites at one time. But the other reason why you want to keep this consistent is if you don't, and you select a particular report suite or a group of report suites and you want to update them or add new classifications, you're going to see this really scary red box that I'm showing here, which is going to tell you, by the way, you've selected a bunch of report suites and the report suites don't have consistent classification set up across them. Now, of course, Adobe is nice enough to tell you that there's a problem, but they won't actually tell you which report suites are inconsistent. So you have to go one by one, which is a pain, especially if you have hundreds of report suites. So once you've got your sync classification set up, how do you get the metadata into Adobe Analytics so your users can take advantage of that data? So there's three different ways. One is you can manually upload metadata via CSV or FTP. Second, you could programmatically do it using the Saint API, either by yourself or with the help of a third-party tool, or you can dynamically assign your metadata using the Saint classification rule builder. And I'm going to touch upon each of these. Now, if you're doing it manually, then you would download a file that is in the admin console that is a template, and it will have all of the settings needed. It will know what is the key, and the key is what was collected in JavaScript, what is the variable that's already in Adobe Analytics, and then it will show you a column for each of your classifications. Now, you can either download a blank template or you can export a template that has all of the keys that have been collected in JavaScript up to that minute, and then you can populate in the other columns and then basically upload it as a spreadsheet. Unfortunately, you can only upload up to 1 megabyte of data at a time if you're doing it through CSV. So if you have 3 megabytes worth, then that's fine. You could just split it up into 3 files and do 1 megabyte at a time. But if you have a lot of data, then you probably want to move more towards the FTP upload. And FTP, you can just put a lot more data, but it's a little bit more work. You've got to set up an FTP client. You get the username and password from the admin console. But the cool part, as I mentioned earlier, is you can upload the same FTP file to multiple report suites if needed. Now, if you're a little more technically inclined, you can read the documentation on the Saint API, and you can automate some processes at your company to have an API that'll automatically update your metadata. If you're a little more lazy like me, and you want to do it quickly and want to use an API, there are third-party tools out there. One that I've worked with quite a bit in the past is called Claravine. And what they do is they give you kind of a front-end interface where you can share it with your stakeholders, and they can help you populate the metadata in something that looks kind of like a spreadsheet, and then simply push a button, and then it will go out and use the API on your behalf to update your metadata in your analytics tool. The last way to do it is through the Saint Rule Builder, which has probably become much more popular in the last couple of years. Now, the Saint Rule Builder allows you to classify your data on the fly, and it does it a couple different ways. One is you could use kind of some text operators, like I'm showing on the left, where you could say, if it starts with, if it ends with, if it contains these things, like I'm showing on the right, if it starts with email : display : paid search : that's a way that if you're consistent with how you're capturing data in the key, you could have it look at those strings and automatically classify. So for example, row 1, we would put into the channel of email, and then 2 would be display, and 3 would be paid search. The other way that you can use Rule Builder is using regex, and this is kind of a little bit of a slightly modified version of regex. But what you can do is read kind of the guidelines of how regex works, and you could set up these expressions to basically parse the values that are passed into the key and then automatically classify. However, this requires that you're really rigid and really strict on the naming conventions of the values that are captured in JavaScript into the key variable. Otherwise, you're going to end up in trouble because the Rule Builder regex expressions will not kick in. So if that happens, Adobe has provided a backup. And the backup is that you can actually combine using the Saint classification Rule Builder and manual uploads. So in the Rule Builder, you'll notice that there's an area that says, do you want the rules to overwrite any existing values or only unset values? So if you choose the one on the left, then if you've manually uploaded data and the same key value is in the manual upload and it meets a Rule Builder rule, then the Rule Builder is going to overwrite what you manually uploaded. If you use the one on the right, then the manually uploaded data will overwrite the Rule Builder rule. And the reason this is useful is if you have a Rule Builder, and let's say 95% are being classified through the Rule Builder, you can then use a manual upload to take care of the other 5%. And then it's just up to you to decide if, which one you want to win if the same key appears both times. So another thing you can do with Saint classifications is use them to save or conserve variables, which is something that is pretty common for large implementations. Usually people run out of evars. That tends to be the variable people run out of if they're not paying the big bucks for 250 evars. So by understanding Saint classifications, you can figure out ways to save variables. And one technique that I've used a lot is concatenation. So here's an example of an old client of mine that had about 10 or 15 data points that they wanted to track related to content, but they were running low on evars. So what we did is we concatenated in a very fixed, rigid way the different values, and then we used a separator here, a little caret here in between them. And that report was kind of meaningless by itself, evar 28. But what we did is we created a bunch of Saint classifications so that there'd be individual reports that would split all this out. And we told people to kind of ignore evar 28, but use all of the metadata around evar 28. And then we set up a regex rule that would basically split all of this out. So as long as no one messed up passing the data in the right way, then everything worked out, and they could use one evar instead of like 12 or 20 evars. So that's a really cool, handy way to think about using Saint classifications. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is When do you use saint classifications versus using just a good old-fashioned EVAR or SPROP? And this is probably where I see people mess up the most when it comes to saint classifications. Now, here's kind of an example. If I look at this customer's implementation, there's actually two mistakes being made here. They have a customer ID, EVAR44, and that has a classification of the CRM segment, which maybe they're taking from a data warehouse and saying these customers are in this segment and these customers are in this segment. So that's a sync classification. And then they also have another EVAR45 for the customer birth year. Now, this is not how I would do it. The first mistake here is that I would treat customer birth year as a sync classification, because that's never going to change, and that just wastes an EVAR. That, every customer has one birth year. But this scenario where they're using the CRM segment as a sync classification, that should not be a sync classification, because that value can change. And I'll illustrate this a little more here. So this all has to do with the retroactive nature of sync classifications, and this forces you to be deliberate in their use. So sync classifications are useful when you want the ability to change or modify data in the future. So for example, if you have an external campaign, you got a bunch of campaign codes, you put them under the campaign name of, 2020 spring campaign. But then it turns out that there's, 50 of those codes that you messed up on and they actually weren't part of the spring campaign. Well, that's no problem. You can just update the metadata and they'll be fixed, and it will always look like they were correct in the right campaign name. But sync classifications can also be useful, as I mentioned, to save variables when the metadata is inherent, meaning it will never change, to the dimension that you're classifying. So for example, if I have a customer ID, I can put birth year in a regular EVAR, but it's kind of silly because I could just one time upload the birth year of every customer, and that's never going to change. That's a waste of an EVAR. But that's a perfect use case of saving a variable with the same classification. Now, sync classifications are not useful when you want to preserve the value at the time the data is sent into Adobe Analytics. And this is super critical. I can't stress this enough. The reason why CRM segment was wrong and should not have been in a sync classification is, let's say I'm customer ID 11125. And today you upload a sync classification that says that I'm in the baby boomer high net worth segment, for example. Well, if 3 weeks later, we decide that that customer ID with that same ID doesn't belong in that segment anymore, and we change this segment, well, that is going to look like that customer ID's behavior has always been part of the different CRM segment, because it won't remember the old segment that last month this person was in the baby boomer and this month they're not. So because the metadata can change dynamically, it's terrible to do that as a sync classification. Another easy way to think of this is age. For example, if you have customer ID and you upload that a certain customer is 40 years old, well, guess what? Next year, that customer is going to be 41. And when you upload that they're 41, it's going to look like all the behavior they did forever. They were always 41 when they did it. And next year, they were always 42 when they were actually 40, or maybe 35 at the time they did something. So that's when you want to capture it in real time in a variable, if at all possible. And if you can't capture that in real time, you can always use DB Vista to look up the value in real time to a table. And I'm going to be talking about DB Vista in another training session, where you could look up on their ID, their current age or CRM segment, and then insert that into a real variable so it's locked in forever. Because anything that goes into an EVAR or SPROP is locked in for good. The other time when sync classifications are not useful is if you're really relying on data feeds in Adobe Analytics to maybe populate your data lake. Sync classifications do not come through in data feeds because they really don't exist. They're kind of fake. So if it's really important that you have a data point in your data lake, then you're probably going to want to pass it to a real variable, or you're going to have to supplement the data feed that comes out of Adobe with your sync classification file as well. Another point I want to mention is, what do you do if your sync classifications are messed up? And I see a lot of cases where sync classifications are messed up and need to be fixed. Well, You know that it's messed up if you open up a Saint classification file and you see a very high number of percentage of unspecified. In this case, I'm going to the extreme and say that there is actually no metadata for message name and it's 100% unspecified. So if that's the case, my little trick is if you're manually uploading your Saint classifications, simply download your file. And there's even a way that you can do it, as I'm showing on the right, where you could check off a box and say, I want to download all of my Saint metadata, but I only want to see the metadata where message name is empty. And so now on the left, you see all the keys that are missing a message name. And you could just fill those in, upload it, and then your unspecified will go down. If you're using the Saint Rule Builder, it's a little trickier. What you can do is take your unspecified row and break it down by the root or the key value, the item that was classified. So in this case, I'm classifying the Cheetah campaign ID with message name. And if I break down the unspecified, I will see all of the campaign IDs that are missing a message name. And now I can figure out what's going on. Is there something wrong with my rule builder or whatever? But this is breaking it down by the root is just an easy way to figure out where you're missing stuff. And the last things I want to talk about around Saint classifications are what I just call some Adobeisms, some weird things that you have to memorize about Saint classifications because it's stuff that you may not know and it can really trip you up. The first thing is that for some reason, unbeknownst to me, it is impossible to classify a dimension value of 0. So if you ever pass in 0, or in some cases, even things that have leading zeros, it won't let you add any metadata to it. I don't know why, that's just the way it is. So a best practice is to never pass a 0 into an EVAR or an SPROP and pass the phrase 0 instead, and that way you can classify it. And if you already have 0 in your report, I hate to tell you, like, you can never classify it. So you might just want to switch to a new EVAR or SPROP from now on and never put the 0 in and then decommission the old one. The next thing is if you have special characters in your key values, this can really mess up your Saint classification. So generally, Adobe recommends that you avoid using special characters, commas, extra quotes, and so on. However, if you want to get a little more advanced, in the help area of Saint, there is a different way that you can change to a different template. So instead of using version 2.0, you can use it to version 2.1, and that will help you in some areas where you can't help but having some of these special characters. So you could read a lot more about that and talk to client care if you need some help with that. The next thing is about pre-classification. There are some cases where you want to actually set up the metadata before you actually capture the key values. For example, you might have an EVAR where you want to capture the number of search results when someone does a search on your site. And there could be 1 or 2 or 10 or 1,000. Well, if you pick a number like 20,000, you can upload a metadata value of saying, if we have a search with 17,532 results, I want to bucket that into, over 15,000 results or whatever. So you can send the metadata in even before you have the keys. However, Adobe will charge you 1 server call for each value. But again, usually that's not that big of a deal. And again, there's more help text here, and it only applies to manual uploads. They don't charge you for pre-classifying things with like the rule builder. That wouldn't make any sense, but just something to know that you can pre-classify. Another thing is that if you and your users hate the none row or the unspecified row in reports, there's nothing you can do if you've never collected data, but in the metadata reports, you can actually classify the unspecified row using a tilde, none tilde, which means that if you're looking at the metadata reports like channel and campaign name, instead of seeing unspecified, you can be more descriptive, like I'm showing here, and say no marketing channel, no campaign name. That way you can communicate to your users that there is no data, but I know that there's no data, and that's intentional. And again, I put a little snippet of the help text from Adobe there. And then lastly, if there's a weird case where you've uploaded the wrong Saint classification metadata, and That's not a problem because you could always re-upload again and fix it with new metadata. But in the weird case where you've uploaded wrong data and you actually don't have any new correct data, you just want to get rid of the old bad data, you can use tilde empty tilde to blank out the metadata that you've uploaded, and then it will go back to blank. So this can be useful in some weird cases, but just keep in mind that it's available if you need it. So that was a lot about Saint classifications. I'm not sure if everyone wants to know that much about Saint classifications, but if you do, hopefully that covers most of your questions. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at some of the questions that are out there. So if you have questions about anything that I have just shared, go ahead and put them into the Zoom Q&A right now, and I will take a look at answer as many as I can. So first question I've got here is, I have found some odd situations when using classifications rules where values should have been qualified by the rule as shown unspecified. This happens despite the rule being tested successfully. Why can this happen? Is there any limitation on what classification rules are documented aware of? So Jose, I'd have to see the exact situation. I haven't seen that much. I have seen people who think that everything is fitting their rules, but then they find out later that it's actually not. And sometimes it could be like a ghost space or something in there that could cause a problem. But Jose, if you have an example that you can send me, then I'd be more than happy to take a look at it. Next question. Do you know if there are plans by Adobe to overhaul the upload process, support XML, faster processing? I have been told that there is a bunch of new updates that are coming for Saint classifications, but I haven't been told what they are going to be. But another thing I want to mention while we're talking about Saint classifications is that many of you have heard that Adobe is moving to a new experience platform, and they're moving to customer journey analytics. I just wrote a blog post about this. There is a different way to do Saint classifications in platform that are called lookup or lookup tables. So once you move over to platform and CJA, you're not going to be using Saint classifications anymore. But that notwithstanding, I think Adobe realizes that there will be customers using the kind of current version of Adobe Analytics for a long time. So that they are making some enhancements there. And as soon as those are out, I will certainly be blogging about it and tell you about it. So Pedro had asked, what are some of the main Saint cons to be considered? So I think I covered some of these. To me, it's just using Saint classifications incorrectly and not understanding the retroactive nature of them so that you're actually classifying things where data can change over time. That can really mess people up. And I had many clients that have, classified their customer IDs with attributes from their CRM or data warehouse and didn't realize that every time they updated it, it was completely messing up all of their historical data. But in general, there's not that much harm in Saint classifications. Can we export the dynamically created dimensions measures through the regex rules through data feed? I have never seen a way to do that. So I wish you could do that. If someone knows of a way to do that, please chime in, but I do not believe that's possible. Now, obviously, you can use R or Python, and you could do your own stuff with, to basically spit out a file. I have seen some people who, instead of using the Saint classification rule builder, for some reason decided to export their keys, run a Python or R script on it, classify it that way, and then manually upload it via FTP. I don't know if they just didn't trust Adobe or whatever, but you could certainly do that. Next one. That one I already answered. All of our documents, PDFs and videos, live within Adobe's AEM DAM with a bunch of metadata. We have been manually classifying this metadata every quarter because there's thousands of documents. Every document doesn't have metadata filled out. Is there some automated way to classify this metadata from AEM? So you're basically saying, can you auto-classify from AEM since it already has all the information? So I don't believe there is currently a way to do that. I would definitely talk to Adobe about that. I'm sure it's on their roadmap. They may be waiting for the platform in order to do that and just kind of skip the old version of Adobe Analytics for that. But I would definitely talk to Adobe about that. Next one, if I wanted to group URLs to a specific business unit and the segment got too large and unresponsive, would that be a good use case for a classification? So yeah, if you, I mean, you can group as many as you want. Saint classifications are impacted by the unique limit, which is around 500,000 values in an EVAR or SPROP in a monthly period. So Valerie, I might have to see a little bit more of an example, but I do believe that you can group that, and that way you don't have to build like a segment with thousands of URLs. You know, that would be a good use case. But if I'm misunderstanding that question, then, you know, Valerie, email me and I'll see if I can help out there. What importance, if any, does processing rules have on variable classifications, or saying, can you use processing rules as a method of classification? So unfortunately, I have not seen a way that that's possible. There's really no relationship between processing rules and, say, classifications. Now, I guess you could do some weird stuff there, but I would recommend that you use DB Vista instead of processing rules for that. And I'm going to be covering DB Vista in the next session that we're going to be doing in the SDEC, because that can do a better lookup and it acts kind of like a processing rule. Bruno asked, what is the time frame between the upload in FTP with a .fin file to the display in AA? So this is just bringing up a super detailed point that I didn't mention. It's in the documentation, but when you upload data via FTP for Saint, you first upload the file, and then you upload a file with a special extension called .fin, and that's usually an empty file with the same file name, which is a way to tell Adobe that it's gotten all the data. Because the reason they do this is because you could upload multiple files and then it'll all process. So Bruno was asking, how long does it take? That really depends on how much data you're uploading and if Adobe's having a good day or bad day. So generally, I have found that I think Adobe says that they commit to 24 hours, the metadata will be there, but I've sometimes seen it faster. So that is really subjective. So if you have a problem, I would definitely check with client care and see if, you know, there's a SLA they expect. Next question. Did I get it correct? If we upload pre-classified data by API, no extra fee, server requests will be charged. So it is my understanding that it's not how you do it, it's that you are pre-classifying, but I would definitely check with client care. I believe if you do it through you pre-classify through the API, there is still a chance that you may get charged for server calls for key values that don't exist. I'd be surprised if you didn't get charged. I don't think they really distinguish between the manual upload and the API. So I would just double check with client care and make sure you don't rack up your bill. Next question. Where would you use manual upload versus rule builder? Are there use cases for each? So I tend to use the manual approach when there is a finite number of values that are going to be key values. So for example, if I know that I have a report that has 20 values, then I would just manually classify those, because the amount of time it takes to make a regex rule builder for those 20 values would probably be longer than to do the manual one. And you can just always download your Saint file manually and just add to it if there's any new values. The benefit of using Rule Builder is you may not have to worry about new values popping up if it follows the right regex rules. But generally, if it's thousands of rows or tons of rows, then I would try to work with my developers to make sure we have a consistent naming convention so we can use the rule builder. So I generally do it based on volume. We are using Saint to classify marketing campaign, like campaign name, source, media. When opening up the related report, for example, the source report, we have the first row unspecified with 90% of the data. I did the breakdown trick you showed us, but find that 90% is unspecified, is still unspecified. So that basically means that the values, the key value is not being correctly passed into the root variable. So Cyril, if you would want to email me some examples of the reports, because generally if you break down an unspecified metadata and then you see unspecified, that's Adobe's way of saying, listen, I don't have a key value. So I would look at the root value, which in this case would probably be the s.campaigns variable in Cyril's example. If you don't see an unspecified there, but you see the unspecified when you break it down, then you need to call Adobe and they're having a problem, because that should never be the case. But if you want to send me some screenshots, Cyril, I'm more than happy to take a peek at that. Mitchell, could you speak a little more about why not to classify CRM customer records? I thought this is intriguing. What's the alternative? Yeah, this is a huge mistake that I see people make. So I gave one example, but Mitchell, just to go through another one. Let's imagine that I have a customer ID in an EVAR, and I've got thousands of customer IDs. And let's say that customer ID 100 in my CRM system, I know that the customer lifetime value is $1,000. So I classify my customer ID with the customer lifetime value. That means I can look at any Adobe Analytics reports by customer lifetime value, and I can see a row. It'll group all people that have a lifetime value of 1,000, or maybe I do 1,000 to 2,000 in buckets and so on. But then that customer comes in and buys another $500 worth of stuff. That works its way through your system into the CRM, and now you upload the next day. Well, now customer 100 has a classification value of 1,500. So now, if you look at the data for that person, and you go back 2 years or whatever, or look at a trend, it will always look like customer 100 had a customer lifetime value of 1,500. But that's not true, because just yesterday, their customer lifetime value was 1,000. So the alternative would be that you want to basically upload from your CRM into a DB Vista table, which says customer 100 currently has a value of 1,000, and then the next day customer 100 has a value of 1,500. Then DB Vista will grab that value and then insert the $1,000 or 1,500 into an EVAR, which means it's locked in forever. Which means that yesterday that customer 100 would show as 1,000, and then tomorrow they would show as 1,500. So that's why, and again, I'm going to cover this exact example in my next session, and that's kind of why I cover classification first and then I do DB Vista later, because DB Vista is really like, I call it real-time Saint classifications. Next question. So uploading whether a user is a paying offline subscriber would be better served as an EVAR rather than Saint, because the status can change. Exactly. And then Chris mentions customer attributes. That's another way, but customer attributes are very similar to Saint classifications, and they run into the same problem. So Chris, yes, you would want to document in real time that this is a paying customer versus a offline subscriber, because otherwise if you do that through Saint, it's going to change. And again, rule of thumb, if the data can change over time, you shouldn't be doing it with Saint classifications. The next one, thinking of building an annotation function for web tracking events via Saint classifications by using the date as the key. Any cons doing this? No, that's totally fine. And if you Google an old blog post of mine, if you Google Adam Greco and I think classifying the date, I think I called it key marketing dates. I actually did the same thing you're talking about doing, Francis. And what I did is I documented, did we have a big campaign launch on a date? Or I did it when I was at salesforce.com, and I classified the week of Dreamforce as Dreamforce dates, because that would help me explain why we had a huge spike in lead generation during Dreamforce. So you could think about using, you should always be passing a date to an EVAR anyway, and then yeah, you can classify that with anything you want. Have you tried the Google Sheets method of Saint classification? Yeah, so I think there are some people who have built kind of some ways that you can use you could basically use a Google Sheet and then use the API from the Google Sheet to upload your Saint classifications. Again, I haven't used that. I tend to use, more kind of off-the-shelf products like Clarivine, and I think ObservePoint also has a product that does that. Let me do one last question, and then I'll wrap it up. Do you have to leave an empty row after the header in the metadata file? No, you don't need an empty row. I don't know why when you download it, sometimes it comes with an empty row, but you don't need to have an empty row. So that was a lot of questions. You guys had a lot of questions on Saint classifications. I hope that was helpful. If you have any further questions, please feel free to email me and I'll tackle as many as I can. But thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you on the next SDEC session.